Consider this before viewing Heart of Darkness. What do you know about colonialism throughout history? Can you think of any ideas or actions that have been common among colonial governments? As you watch the program, pay close attention to how the Belgian government treated Africa and Africans at the turn of the century. What drew Europeans to this uncivilized continent? As the 20th century began, things were happening in the Congo region of Africa that would, in the space of 40 years, take the lives of some 5 million people. 5 million murdered outright or dead from exhaustion, starvation, and disease. A British seaman named Joseph Conrad witnessed part of that Black Holocaust and drew from it a lesson that the rest of this century would repeatedly confirm. He put it in a thin novel, or novella, as a tale of greed, self-delusion, and murder, and has given the language a new synonym for evil. Heart of Darkness is a story of a journey up a great river, deep into a primeval jungle. On the surface, it is the story of one man's moral and physical decline in that jungle, told by another sent to find him. Underneath is one of the darkest visions of human nature in modern literature.
The darkness of the environment led to the darkness of the social corruption and led finally to the darkness of the heart. And that's what he's writing about.
A recognition of his own darkness, his own despair. My God, what have I done? He saw very clearly who he was, what he had become.
Charles Marlowe is telling friends about an experience he'd barely survived. Years before, a European trading firm specializing in ivory had hired him to restart a crippled riverboat service in a region much like the Congo. The focus of Marlowe's job soon becomes an effort to reach a station chief named Kurtz. An unusual man, a former journalist who paints, dabbles in science, and has progressive ideas for civilizing the savages. He's also the toughest ivory trader in the region. Since it was written in 1899, Heart of Darkness has been admired throughout the English-speaking world. But in all that time, only 2 motion pictures have attempted the story. In 1978, Francis Ford Coppola took some of Conrad's ideas and very loosely applied them to Vietnam in Apocalypse Now, starring Martin Sheen as Captain Willard, the Marlowe character, and Marlon Brando as Kurtz. But it wasn't until 1994 that Turner Network Television produced an actual film adaptation starring Tim Roth and John Malkovich. Marlowe's Odyssey traces the path of Conrad's own journey up the Congo from Boma to today's Kinshasa and all the way to Kisangani. Marlowe's first stop is the company's lower station where goods are prepared for the sea voyage to Europe. The station accountant briefs him on the problem of getting ivory down from the trading posts upriver.
The stations upriver have been isolated for too long. And some, like Monsieur Court's station, have been utterly cut off. That seems completely out of touch.
Kurtz is the chief of the inner station, the one farthest upstream.
You mean you haven't had too many shipments of ivory?
None.
Ivory. For 500 years, Europe had been content to take from Africa its human treasure, slaves, by the millions. But when that trade ended in the 19th century, other sources of wealth took its place. Ivory, gold and silver, diamonds, and finally, rubber. These were the powerful magnets that now drew Europeans to Africa. And to extract that wealth, a colonial presence was required.
In 40 years, Europe gobbled up virtually all of Africa south of the Sahara. It happened with tremendous speed, with tremendous brutality. The purpose of this conquest, like most conquests in history, was to make money for the conquerors, and they did so hand over fist and killed millions of people in the process.
Most Europeans, including Joseph Conrad, thought colonization was essentially a noble undertaking, and they considered it their destiny to dominate other peoples. This was, after all, the age of Darwin and the widely misunderstood idea of evolution. No question where white and black stood on the evolutionary ladder. For Christians, that conferred certain obligations.
Missionaries were a very important part of these efforts, but their presence in Africa coincided with people hunting for gold, diamonds, raw materials, other sorts of wealth. But in a way, the missionary efforts sort of gave cover to the real quest, which was for wealth.
No one coated greed with sanctimony more deliberately than Belgium's king, Leopold II, who literally made the Congo his own.
He staked out this vast territory that today we know as the Congo, essentially the same borders, 1/13 the size of the African continent, 76 times the size of Belgium. Not a Belgian colony, but the personal possession of King Leopold II, the world's only privately owned colony.
Nowhere in Africa was there a wider gap between words and actions, between the benediction and the rape.
What Leopold did, of course, was to talk about Christ and Christianity and the mission. And it was all a fraud. And that is what Conrad exploited and exploded, the myth of colonialism.
Josef Theodor Konrad Korzeniowski was the son of Polish aristocrats who, with their family, had been exiled to northwest Russia for opposing Russian domination of their country. Conrad's father was an intellectual and translator of Shakespeare, a sometimes poet, as well as a fervent patriot. It is said that Joseph never read a children's book, but did read deeply from grown-up works, including his father's translations and heroic tales of seafarers. At 17, Joseph Conrad struck out on his own, traveling through Austria and Switzerland on his way to France. Finally, at the age of 20, Conrad joined the British Merchant Marine. For 15 years, he sailed under the Union Jack to faraway places in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and rose in the ranks from seaman to captain of a small ship. Some of Joseph Conrad's best fiction would come from those voyages. And then, at the age of 32, he took a job navigating a wood-burning steamer up the Congo River. At the time he went there, thousands were being forced to act as porters for Leopold's minions, carrying heavy loads over great distances.
How do you force people to be porters and to carry elephant tusks for hundreds of miles? You round them up at gunpoint, you chain them together. So there were files of porters in chains carrying this valuable ivory from the center of the continent out to the coasts.
King Leopold named his colony with Orwellian flair, the Congo Free State. That mixture of murderous brutality, cynicism, and lies appalled Conrad and profoundly changed him. It was all part of what Conrad called the vilest scramble for loot that had ever disfigured the history of the human conscience. And it would get worse, much worse. Within a few years of Conrad's departure, the Belgian obsession would turn from ivory to wild rubber, which required prodigious numbers of workers, scouring the jungles for rubber vines to tap. With that came quotas and their brutal enforcement. Conrad had left the Congo before the worst of these atrocities, but from what he did see, he understood the cause of all that would follow. Marlowe's boat awaits him at the central station, which he must reach by foot, bypassing miles of rapids. Arriving, he finds the boat and a surprise.
We are waiting for your arrival at last. This is my steamer. Oh, yes. But it's down there, it's under the water. You understand what I'm saying? My boat...
Repairs will take time. Time enough for Marlowe to learn more about his new surroundings. He is, first of all, struck by the aimlessness of the other Europeans.
They wandered here and there, like a lot of faithless pilgrims bewitched inside a rotten fence. The word ivory hung in the air, was whispered, was sighed. You would think they were praying to it.
Among some writers and intellectuals of that time, Conrad among them, the idea of evolution had raised fears of its opposite, degeneration.
The silent wilderness surrounding this cleared speck on the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion.
Kurtz is topic A here as well, but with an undercurrent of hostility. And there are strange rumors that the man has changed, gone native, has some undefined illness. For these people, he is an ominous figure. Going upriver into a dark unknown, sure that somewhere out there are honors and treasures and savages to be contained or controlled. Marlowe recalls that Roman soldiers ventured like that up the Thames 1900 years before. It too, he says, was one of the dark places of the earth. This is a conqueror's experience, one shared by Lewis and Clark laboring up the Missouri, by French legionnaires traveling up the Mekong and other streams in Indochina, and in a way by the Americans who followed the French up the same rivers. For many, America and Vietnam represented a new kind of colonialism. The use of other people and places, not as sources of wealth or land, but as battlegrounds in a global power struggle.
It was the air cab, first of the night.
That's them.
Our escorts to the mouth of
Those
the
who made Apocalypse Now felt the parallel strongly. John Milius wrote the screenplay.
Mobile. Those boys just couldn't stay.
I thought there was really a similarity between the idea of penetrating the depths of the Congo, you know, to bring light to these benighted savages.
They were both about a great anguish, a great fear, where there was a foreign domination of a people, and there was great destruction and great havoc. I think that that's a pretty fair analogy.
African writers and others have called Conrad a racist, as Africans do not speak and have little or no personal identity. But that also reflects how most whites actually viewed and treated the Africans. Conrad clearly shared the underlying racism of his time. Even so, Marlowe seems at least to recognize the humanity of the Africans, as well as the savage in himself.
No, they were not inhuman. Well, you know, that was the worst of it. This suspicion of their not being inhuman. What thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours. The thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar.
Arriving finally at the inner station, all rumors paled before the reality. Kurtz, though severely weakened by fever, turns out to be a law unto himself and a god to the people of this village, who do whatever he tells them. Those who don't, decorate the compound. He has given up trading for ivory in favor of raiding for it, getting Africans to kill Africans for his profit.
Oh yes, I heard him. My ivory, my station, my river. Everything belonged to him. But that was a mere trifle. The thing to know was what he belonged to. How many powers of darkness claimed him for their own.
Exposing the savage beneath the silk, Kurtz mocks the Europeans' belief in their own essential goodness. He has become their Darwinian nightmare realized. And now Kurtz is dying. His illness, his lifestyle, and the jungle have conquered him. As Marlowe listens, he utters one of literature's most famous enigmas. Marlowe tells us Kurtz said, "Pronounce judgment on the adventures of his soul on this earth." But readers are left to interpret for themselves just what that horror was.
The horror could be about the horror of imperialism. It could be about the destruction of character, moral character.
Horror was the honesty of seeing at the end who he was, realizing what he had done, and it was despair.
That we're all guilty. We all have the stain upon us.
In England, a protest movement was formed to denounce the Congo atrocities. Its leader, one Edmund Morel, said that Conrad's novella was valuable in exposing those horrors. But Conrad kept his distance from the reformers. He did not consider himself in any way political. The reformers and the journalists focused on the victims of this terror, doing all they could to advertise and stop it. Conrad took a different tack and focused on the colonists.
then he goes deeper and deeper and deeper and realizes and makes you realize that, in fact, what is maybe a story about exploitation in the jungle is also a story about the human condition, is also a story about the relationship between the West and the rest.
Like Conrad, Marlowe returns to Europe a sadder, wiser man in serious need of recuperation. It is a full year before he goes back to what he calls the sepulchral city, Brussels in real life, to give Kurtz's fiancée the man's personal papers. She wants to know about the end, his last words.
"Repeat them," she said in a heartbroken tone. I was on the point of crying at her. "Don't you hear them?" The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us. The horror, the horror. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he spoke was, "Your name."
Truth was so terrible that whilst he could carry the burden of it as the kind of last disciple of the man, he didn't want to offer it to others because they wouldn't understand.
You keep your mouth shut, you carry on living your own life, you don't tell people, unless you want to be terribly unpopular, that that prosperity is based on the exploitation and death of other cultures and other countries and other communities.
So the lie endured. Traffic flows unconcerned today around the magnificent buildings and monuments in the center of Brussels, which date from that time.
These were built with money that was sucked out of the Congo in a period of very, very brutal slave labor. I think that is part of the horror that Marlowe is talking about in the novel.
Joseph Conrad had looked deeply into that jungle, into the nature of things, and had understood that what he had seen would rise again and again. And Marlowe had decided not to even try explaining it to Kurtz's fiancée, because, as he tells his audience, it would have been too dark altogether. Keep watching. Discussion questions, activities, and resources for Heart of Darkness are coming up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Heart of Darkness, talk about this. Kurtz's dying words are a cryptic whisper. The horror, the horror. What horror might Kurtz have been talking about? Is there more than one possibility? Why do you think Conrad made this scene so ambiguous? Support your opinion with examples from the novel and Conrad's personal history. Now try this. Conrad gives his African characters little personal identity. Write a scene in which one of Kurtz's workers tells his story to Marlowe. Include dialogue that expresses how Africans might have felt toward the colonial presence on their continent. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Heart of Darkness. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests A Joseph Conrad Companion, edited by Leonard Orr and Ted Billy.